Today I wanted to talk to you about a topic that I came upon completely by coincidence. So I've been working with Holocaust survivors and their children for many years now, for about 30 years. And for many years of those, I ran, as Elisa said, a group for children of survivors and other things for the Holocaust families in Metro West. And it just became gradually a thing that I was noticing as I was interviewing people for the groups, or I was interviewing people in relation to their parents and to services for their parents. I did not intend to go after that information. I did not particularly have anything in mind about sibling relationships, but it became obvious as I was talking to people. It just came up again and again and again. I would talk to people and I would ask, so, do you have siblings? And it would come up as, oh, that's a long story, or, oh, that's a lange Geschichte, and, no, I don't want to talk about it, or even worse than that, yes, I do, but I haven't spoken to my brother in 20 years. I'm sure that there are such cases also in Israel, but it's a lot harder because Israel is small. It's very difficult not to talk with your brother for 20 years or your sister, even if you wanted to. So while I'm sure that the dynamics exist, and I'm sure that there are some even who manage to do that, it was a very striking phenomenon for me. And of course it caught my attention. And then after a while, I made sure to gather that information specifically and to ask about relationships with siblings and how it is. How many people here have a sibling? Most of us do, right, exactly. So first of all, the majority of people in the United States have a sibling, and certainly the majority of Holocaust survivor families had more than one child. So it's definitely representative that most of us have siblings. And what I want to present to you is a pattern that I began to see through the years. Now, granted, we have to look at it as, first of all, just an observation. Because when I started seeing the children of survivors, of course, they were all already grown up. So we're looking at something that may be the outcome of a lot of different things. I don't know what it's the outcome of, because everybody was already grown up and adult. But this is the pattern that I started seeing. What I started seeing when I looked more closely into it was a pattern where usually people would describe themselves and their siblings, and it would be where there is one child in the family who I fondly came to call the Shlemazol, which is not really fair because some of the Shlemazols are very gifted and very talented. But nonetheless, why did I call it that? Because it's the person who stayed geographically close to the parents, did not move geographically further away, and often led a life that continued to be very intertwined with the lives of the parents, often, sharing a lot and telling them a lot about themselves and involving them a lot in their problems and issues. And often that child was also financially very intertwined with the parents, either because they were trying to be so helpful to the parents. That's kind of part of the story, yes, that they couldn't have a job that was more demanding, and therefore the parents had to support them more, or because it was I will just throw a few characteristics and then we can go more in details. Sometimes it was a daughter, many times it was the daughter. And when it was the daughter, it was more acceptable, relative to the way we grow up and socialization and how women and men are socialized somewhat differently. So it was more acceptable often that the girl did not have a profession, did not go far away, did not establish a career, but ran her own household and took care of the parents. When it was a man, that is a boy, that took that role in the family, it was usually associated with much more severe interference with many aspects in the lives of these men. It's a small group of men that were brilliant, usually brilliant guys, who had usually very difficult relationships with their survivor parent, especially the survivor father, and they never moved away. They often were part of the family business in not exactly very successful ways. So working in the family business was often more like an alibi for the fact that this son is really not able to find a job or keep a job somewhere else, even though, like I said, every single one of these men that I met were not only very intelligent and very talented, but usually above average talented and brilliant. So there's a question that we can go further into there. So there is the child that, like I said, stayed close by, stayed intertwined with the parents, did not manage to separate well, and led a very intertwined lives with the parent. And when I say intertwined, I don't mean just being supportive to the parent. I mean, for example, a woman who actually did have a career as an administrator at the Yeshiva University, which you all know is in the Bronx. Her mother lived quite far away from there, and she and her family lived a little bit further away in New Jersey from the mom. And every day on her way back from work, every day on her way back, she would stop at her mother's after work and get home only around 10 o'clock in the evening. And that is when her children were growing up. As you can imagine, there was a very untoward effect on the children and the relationship with the children. And her husband, who was a dentist, the reason finally when she came to me, the reason that brought her to therapy was at that point her mother had already passed away, but the husband had disclosed that he had been in a relationship with his secretary for quite a few years.
Can I jump in for 1 second? Can we talk about confidentiality?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Examples and professions and Yeshiva University and dentists. Yeah.
Right. So I would like to very much, he wasn't a dentist actually. As I do it, I already
You're changing,
right. You know, maybe he was a podiatrist, maybe he was a OBGYN, but I don't say what he actually was. However, it's a very good point that Elisa is reminding me, which is that we would like to think that we can speak here. You know, it's not a lecture. It's a discussion group. It's a conversation, and we hope that some of what I say, and I mean, it could happen that I would say something that I forgot to transform in my mind despite the habit, and certainly other people might throw in something or tell something about themselves, and we are assuming that we are all going to maintain the confidentiality and respect the boundaries of this group and not come out of here and say, oh, you know, Dr. Felsen said this person from Yeshiva University, let me see an administrator. Who do I know there? Who lived in New Jersey, who had an old mother, who, you know. We are hoping that we can count on everybody maintaining confidentiality of the discussions.
And all of the factors and any examples of yours are changed by.
Right. And of course, I am always, as I use examples, I am transforming them in my mind already, because it really doesn't matter what kind of a physician the husband was and where exactly at the university the person worked. It's just, you know, it's near the truth, but with some changes. Okay? So where was I? So as I said, some of the times the child who who stayed closer by is also financially more intertwined with the family and with the parents. And the story is that We call these situations often in family therapy caretaking caretaker, because it's this mixed situation where it's not really clear, is the child there more taking care of the parents? And they do. There's no question that they do, that this is the child that's closer, and this is the child who maybe goes with the parents to different things and is there to take care and help in many ways. But there's also no question about the fact that that child also elicits from the parents a lot more caretaking than the other siblings. So it's a caretaking caretaker child. So I saw that there would be one like that in the family, and then there would be others in the family, or another in the family, who would be very, very different. That would be the child who allowed themselves to move further away, went to college further away, made life choices that were much more independent of the parents' wishes, sometimes even against the parents' wishes. And I have examples of each cases that I can give you. That child lived a much more independent life, was usually much more financially, professionally successful than the other child, and was also much less close or intertwined with the parents. And I say both things, less close and less intertwined. And I'll explain a little bit more in a minute. Certainly less close in terms of including the parents in all of their mices, and what was going on and their problems and this and that. Really sort of creating some kind of a shield and not telling the parents about it. Not certainly. So an example would be, in a certain family, I had a patient. She was the one who initially, she was a girl, and initially she was going to stay close to her parents and take care of them. Parents had a very successful business in Canada, and the mother had a lot of depressive episodes. So she was a highly functional woman, but in between she had very severe depressive episodes, and she had a very severe, actually, addiction to Valium and some alcohol dependence, which of course was not diagnosed and was not treated. So there were many times when she was in bed and the girl had to be actually carrying the household. There was also a brother, very bright brother, who belonged to that group of brothers, as I told you, who were very, very kind of out of control. They were the bad boys. They caused a lot of grief to the parents. They had problems in school. So the teachers would call, the teacher would complain, the parents were always busy with this child, they were always very angry, very upset, and she was the good girl. As he grew up, the boy, he was not able to hold down a job. He was very bright, as I said. He would get good jobs, but he would lose them every so often. Finally, he was taken into the parents' business. But like I said before, many of these children who became part of the family business, it was really only an alibi, and they weren't really productive there. They didn't really do a good job there, or at least that's what the parents told the sister, that he's not really doing a good job. They complained a lot about him and so forth. But she got married, and that took her out of that role. Girls have to follow their husbands. The husbands have to follow their parnasa. So he came to the United States. She came with him, and that changed things. The boy stayed by the parents and became that very intertwined son. A lot of fights with the parents, a lot of problems in the relationships, a lot of phone calls from Canada of how terrible he is and how awful he is. And she was here. And by the sheer fact that she was taken here by her husband's, job, she was protected from a lot of things. And she would drive up to Canada with a car full of frozen foods. She was a very good daughter. She would do that very often, but she was protected. What am I trying to tell you? When the parents got sick, when the parents were at the end of their lives, my intent was to maybe give you a flavor of it by reading a few lines from a letter that she shared with me, but then I figured, oh well, I'll just tell you about it. He wrote her a letter that captures very well something that I see a lot in the families that and that is very important to me. That's why I thought it was so important for us to talk about it, because what happens is she felt all those years that he was, what's the term, incredibly mooching off of the parents, really draining them from everything, draining from the business, from money, draining them financially, draining them emotionally. He had 2 divorces. He had problems here and problems there. From the time he was in school, it never ended. He drained them all the time in every possible way. And she was very upset about it, because we are all children of survivors, very aware of our parents. We have to keep them okay. We have to protect them. We have to shield them. And these dynamics make the one child who's self-sufficient. She, by the way, let me add that to just show you an extreme case, yes, but it's not that extreme. And as I said, these 2 types of what I call really adaptation. These 2 types of relational adaptation. The one who remains very intertwined and dependent, and the one who becomes pointedly self-sufficient and rejects any interference from the parents and puts up a wall and is the one with whom everything is always okay, yes? You see those 2 types at different levels of health or pathology. So you can see examples of it that are very pathological, where the one who's very dependent is very dependent and didn't succeed in any way in life and is really the ultimate kind of schlemazel that didn't make it. And you can see it at higher levels, where it's someone who did succeed to some extent, but still has the same general characteristics when you compare them to their brother or sister or siblings. Yes? So when she went through her husband went through a bankruptcy, she, on the other hand, did not tell her parents at all about it. She had 3 jobs, and her parents never knew anything about it. I can tell you about children of survivors of that type who had bankruptcies, miscarriages, cancer, heart attacks. They did not tell their parents anything about it. They protected the parents. Mind you, there is also another thing that happens when these children protect their parents from knowing anything. They also protect themselves. And they manage, under this wall of, this firewall that they build around themselves between their issues and the parents, they manage to create a safe zone for themselves in which they can actually experiment with different things, develop all kinds of skills, be in all kinds of places, go to all kinds of places, which, if the parents knew that they were doing it, the parents would put on them all of their anxieties and all of the pressures not to do it. So by protecting the parents from knowing it, they're also protecting themselves from the pressure of parental anxiety, and they give themselves the chance to develop in a hidden way, so to speak, much more autonomy, much more self-sufficiency, much more confidence and expanding into the world. The cost of it, though, everything in life has a cost, right? The cost of it is that for these people, they actually, in many, many ways, raise themselves. They don't really have a relationship with their parents as we would like to think is optimal for children to have. They can't come to their parents and tell them, when there are some issues, when there are some problems, when they have dilemmas, when they have options and they don't know which option is better for their development, opportunities that somebody points them at and they don't know. They really raise themselves in many ways, and they don't get the benefit of the scaffolding that we would like to give our children, right? We would like to allow our children the possibility to develop their self-sufficiency, their independence, but with some scaffolding around them so that they can come to us and say, hey, you know, I heard that there is this program in the other side of this big country, and they say that it's a great thing. What do you think? And we hope that our response, unlike many traumatized parents, would not be, what? The other side of the country? And who's going to be there watching for you? And how are you going to be okay? And who's going to take care of you? Oh, no, it's too far. No, it's too cold. No, it's too hot. No, it's too whatever it is, right? So the children who protected their parents from hearing anything about themselves did develop more self-sufficiency, did develop more confidence, but at the cost of being alone and relying only on their own resources and learning that that's how life is for them, that they are always to take care of just themselves. There's nobody for them to rely on, and they're on their own, and they have to be very closed. That often became generalized also to the type of marriages that they made. So these are often people who are very self-sufficient, very successful, very well-adjusted in terms of their achievements in the world, but in their close relationships, their friends, their wives or their husbands, often wives, will say they're very closed, or they will say to me, if they come, and often they come because either of problems in the marriage or because they themselves have come to some point where they feel really not well, and they say, I'm alone. I have this beautiful family. I do everything I can for my wife. I do everything I can for my daughters or my children. They love me, but I'm alone. I can't talk to them. They don't really know me. They don't really care about certain things that they consider, just my mishigas. They feel alone, just like they were alone at home, and they don't see how much they contribute to them being alone because they don't really know how to share. They don't really know how to let someone else take care of them. They chose somebody that they can take care of because that's what they were good at. That's what they were comfortable with. They did not choose someone that could take care of them, and they did not develop a relationship that they could be taken care of in. So they develop also, I'll mention also that, they're also very angry. They're very angry because it's come to here with them, the fact that they always take care of other people's needs, and their needs are not ever taken care of in the different relationships that they have. What I think and what is so important for me to talk about with our people, with us, is the fact that many, many times siblings at different levels, like I said, it can be at different levels. The letter that the brother wrote to his sister, let's call her Gila and let's call him Alex, okay? He wrote her a letter that expressed so much of what I want to talk about. He said, you had the privilege, you went away. You got the privilege of being away. You got the benefit of it. You built your beautiful family, and because you were away, you had the benefit of just focusing on your family, on your relationship. You had the benefit of all of that. I, in the meanwhile, stayed here all of these times with our parents and with their mishigas. I'm the one who had to deal with them on a daily basis. I'm the one who absorbed all of their mishigas. And it's on my hive, if you like, on my skin, that you were able to have your beautiful life over there. Now, she, on the other hand, for years, has been telling me her bitterness and her pain about the fact that he drained the parents' business of its money. When the parents finally retired, there was almost nothing left of it. He got a lot of help from them during the years because of the first divorce and the second divorce and the support of his children to go to university, while she did not even tell them when she had the 3 bankruptcies. She was very bitter about how he is leeching the life out of them, and all the phone calls of how horrible he was and how upset the parents were. So you get the 2 sides, if you like, here in an extreme way, but you get it in milder ways in many, many other families, where the one child is very, very connected, very intertwined, feels that that was at the cost of a lot of things that they didn't do that they would have liked to do perhaps, and that the other one was emancipated from all of it, was freed from all of it because of their sacrifice. The other one that is away, they also feel, by the way, the one that stayed by the parents, also feels often that the one that's far away is hurting the parents very much by not sharing enough with the parents, not including the parents. The parents feel that they're not really emotionally close enough, that they don't mean as much to this child, that this child is not emotionally, they feel if I were to put one word on it, that child abandoned the family emotionally. Emotionally, not, these are often good children who still come to visit and do everything that you're supposed to do, but the feeling by the one who stayed close by, and sometimes the parents also say, yeah, well, he's a good son, or yeah, she's a good daughter, but she's far away. They indicate that they feel that emotionally they don't have that closeness with the child, and so the one who's close by feels that in that way the sibling that went far away abandoned and hurt the parents. The one that went far away feels, like I said, that the one close by sucked the life out of the parents, and also sucked the life and the health out of the parents exactly by being too close and telling them about all their problems and sharing all the problems. So we get that sort of mutual criticism over the years that builds up about each other's very different role in the family, which also, as I say, often is generalized to the way that the 2 siblings or the siblings live in the world, their lives. There's a lot of criticism about each other. And what happens when the parents are aging and ailing in all families, not just in our families, siblings are called back in to have much more interaction with each other than they had for several decades. So all of a sudden they're pulled back in, and they have to interact with their siblings and with their parents in ways that they hadn't done in a long time. And that calls up a lot of things. It activates in all families a lot of old resentments. Just one second. There was a question here. If we stop, let's take a couple of questions. The question was, what leads to these differences between siblings, right? So that is a fantastically interesting question. And actually, not only in Holocaust survivors, but in general. And it's really a field, the whole attention to sibling relationships. Let me backtrack a little bit and say something about that. Attention to sibling relationships in psychology has been relatively little, much, much less than the attention to the relationship between, let's say, parents and children, right? Much more attention has been given to that. And it's actually, I think, something that needs to be changed and is slightly changing now, because think about it, the relationship with the siblings that we have are, for those of us who have a sibling, I think most of us can testify to the fact that it is actually a very significant aspect of family life for children who grow up in a family with siblings. It is also, if you think about it, the longest relationship that we have in our life. It's longer than the relationship with our parents, it's longer than the relationship with our spouse, and it's longer than the relationship with our children. It's the longest relationship that we have. What studies show us is also that what I said is true when we look at, when we really examine the relationships between siblings in childhood and in adolescence, we see that it is really, the sibling relationship is, in many, many cases, for most people, it is what we call an attachment relationship. So we don't all grow up in families where we have a very important relationship with our parents, you know, the hierarchical thing, each child and their attachment to the parents above, and then there are those people around us that are siblings. It's not like that. We also have an attachment relationship with siblings. And we also see in studies that when there are difficult times in the family, especially when there are difficult times because of marital conflict, siblings can step in for each other as very important attachment figures and can provide that umbrella of protection for each other when there is an issue in the family because of parental illness, marital conflict, all kinds of things like that. And in old age, when we're really old and vulnerable again, we also see the importance of siblings, and siblings are one of the main support systems. They provide socialization, they provide help to each other. So it is a very, very important relationship in life, and it's very important for us, therefore, to understand how to support it in our children, in our grandchildren. What are the factors that make it better so that they will have that as a resource for their lives? And what are factors, maybe such as parental trauma, that can interfere with the quality of that relationship? So to go back to your question, not only in Holocaust families, but in all families, there are processes that we call de-identification between siblings, sibling differentiation, or sibling de-identification, which means that siblings in the same family become what they are, not only by, you know, their own genetic makeup, which of course is true, you know. Anybody who had more than one child will attest to the fact that babies come to the world different from one another in temperament, in many, many things, right? That's one element. But in addition to that, processes of differentiation between siblings or de-identification refer to things that are the ways in which we come to be what we are because our siblings have already taken certain roles. Because he is good at that, I don't want to be. And because she is good at that, I'm going to be good at something else. There is a natural tendency to differentiate yourself from your siblings and to become different than they are. Why? There are many hypotheses as to why that is the case. So one general way of looking at it is really about division of resources, if you like. Children want to be, each child wants to be very special and unique, and each child wants to somehow, to their parents, unique and special to their parents. And so there's the issue of really parental love as a resource or parental appreciation. There's also the issue of real resources. You know, if this one has to go to become, I don't know, the best swimmer, then maybe the family can't afford two best swimmers and all the stuff that goes into that. So I'll become the best runner. And family resources in various ways, practical and also emotional. There is a certain division, if you like, of the resources by each child trying to be very different and carving out their own niche, especially really with regards to what will be their unique contribution or their unique good thing or good traits with regards to parental love and appreciation. So that's one view as to why it is. In terms of a more sort of nature-based additional aspect of it, you can say that nature is very, very wise, or God has created the world in a very, very wise way. And if people are very different in the family, then no matter what happens, there's a better chance that some of them will survive. If the catastrophe or the situation calls for this, but not for this, or if the situation calls for this and not for that, at least somebody will survive of the family. We do have temperamental differences, yes. And every child and their temperament interacts differently with the environment or with the parents and who they are and what they are like, yes? Now, one child will see, I'll give you real examples that we all know, yes? One child will tell you that when they saw their, okay, here is my patient M, okay? M says that her father, who also, again, we're talking about survivors from the chart that I showed you last time, people who functioned very well in society, worked hard, had a good business, managed to supply and provide everything for the families, but sometimes were very post-traumatic nonetheless. So her father, when upset, would cry terribly. And to her, it was impossible to see that. It went right through her, and really whatever he didn't want her to do, she wouldn't do. So she didn't go to college further away, and she didn't do this and she didn't do that because she knew they couldn't take it. It would cause them a lot of pain. You could say she was very sensitive to it, yes? Right? Her brother, on the other hand, was one of these other boys, the other siblings that I described, who became a very, very problematic boy and did everything bad and drove cars, did all kinds of terrible things, knowing very well that the parents were going nuts with pain, you could say. And what the father would say is, he doesn't care about us at all. For this we survived the Nazis. He's worse than Hitler. He doesn't care. He's torturing us. He's doing terrible things to us. He would cry, and M hated her brother for it. Until she came to therapy. And by the way, that brother, in the end, went into the army, the American army, because he wanted to make something of himself. And they could not afford, sending him to college, and he wasn't going to go to community college like his sister. He wanted to make something of himself. He went into the American army. My patient described to me with tremendous anger towards her brother what a son of a you-know-what he was. How he did not care that her father cried his eyes out for 3 consecutive days to try and prevent him from going into the army. He didn't give a you-know-what. He went into the army, the selfish son of a you-know-what. She was very angry with him and very much really hated him for it. Until you stop to think for a minute that from his perspective, unfortunately, this was his only way of getting some autonomy. He was really fighting for his survival. He had to do it this way. She gave in, and she paid for it very dearly. She was very, very constricted. She didn't do what she needed to do. She married a terrible man who, seemed like the right guy to bring to her parents, but was completely not the right guy for her, who treated her with the same control and the same as her parents treated her, except for different reasons. Her parents had a good reason. They were traumatized. He was just a controlling, unwell man. So that's the price she paid. And what she couldn't see was that what seemed to her like such terrible selfishness was his only way to be a man. A man. She could be a very constricted woman married to someone else who essentially kept her and provided for her. He had to make a life for himself. And the only way to do it was to be that bad boy, because anything that he did that was a little bit more expensive caused the father to cry, and the only way to deal with this was to completely close himself to the pain of the parents and do what he had to do. So sometimes it's very important for us to develop a more nuanced way of looking at things. No doubt some people are more selfish than others. No doubt we as individuals have our own value system in which we value more someone who sacrifices themselves for the people that they love than someone who perhaps manages to say, I'm going to shut myself to your pain. I'm gonna, if it's gonna be you or me, it's gonna be me. But some people had to do that. And in the context of parents who are very traumatized, this is why it's so important for us to talk about it. Because in the context of parents who were traumatized, it was very difficult for many people, even good people, to come to a comfortable place within themselves with regards to the balance between being good and sacrificing some things for our parents so as not to hurt them and not to cause them pain and not to make them anxious, but on the other hand, to do what's good for us. You know, I do hear very sad stories. I hear a story of someone who didn't marry the person that she wanted to marry because her father did not think that it was the right, not one story, yes? Stories of that, not marrying the person that you wanted to marry because it would cause your father such. In every family, Holocaust or not, there is the differentiation between siblings. And each sibling, in order to differentiate themselves and find their own niche or their own way of being who they are or their own way of being the good child for their parents, each sibling finds their own way based on a lot of things. Based on innate personality, temperament, talents, based on the way that the culture treats us. If you were born into the same family with the same talents and the same skills, it makes a difference if you're a boy or a girl. Because society around you sends different messages still for what is right for a boy and what is right for a girl. So things around the family, cultural things, innate temperamental things, talents, but also we also become who we are on the basis of roles already taken in the family by other siblings. What we call structural variables in the family, like gender, like age. I have, I think I mentioned to you last time that around the bat mitzvah of my daughter, I got this email from Poland from people that were actually related, but they didn't even know that they were Jewish until very short time before they contacted me. So they were the two young children in a family. They had two older siblings in the family. It was a completely different family, actually, because the two older ones, when they were born, the survivor grandfather was still alive, and he was very depressive and very controlling, and his only son, their father, was very, very much under his, he was very constricted, and he needed to do what his father needed to do, and he needed the children to be exactly like the father needed them to be, and he was very harsh with them and very hard with them because of that. By the time the two little ones came along, the father passed away. So they said, it's amazing how in our family, there are like two families. Two completely different families. The two older ones, the two younger ones, because of age difference, because of a different set of circumstances in the lives of the parents. I also have people who will say, you know, the child that was born right after the war. Survivors had children right after the war, some of them even in the DP camps. So, you know, a friend of mine who was born in the DP camp has a brother who was born already in Israel. It's really, her brother is the age of my sister that was born already in 48 in Israel. And she says, I am the, let's say, Kirschenbaum, the European name, and he is Duvdevani. You know, it's a completely different animal, right? Because of that. So there are many, many things that go into the differentiation. But I will go and sharpen my answer to the question that you really ask, because you ask not only all of those differences, but you ask specifically about the role within the family. How come one person becomes so invested in caring for the family and one person is so selfish and so about themselves? That's really the most poignant part of your question, right? And that is another example of the differentiation and the de-identification in the family, which first of all, like I said, it happens in all families to some extent. But the reason why I thought that it is such an important topic for us to talk about as children of survivors is because from my clinical observations, and I did not run a study on it, I am just telling you something that I have noticed over 30 years of clinical observations with people that came to me as patients, people that I met in conversations like this. You know, many times I would start talking about this phenomenon of the child, like you say, the one who's very involved and the one who's so removed and somewhat less involved, even selfish if you like, at different levels. And I would see people in the audience going like this, right? So what I'm saying is that I believe that the dynamics of trauma specifically, when parents have gone through trauma, that changes the dynamic in the family in a way that specifically accentuates the differentiation between the siblings. Why? Because parental pain and parental anxiety and parental post-traumatic reactions are so difficult for the children to deal with that they cause very accentuated ways of adapting to it. You can't be neutral about it. You know, you can't kind of, you know, my parents are, you know, you can't stay neutral. So you have a much more accentuated differentiation. You can become either someone who, because it matters a lot to them, tries everything possible to make it better, to not make them anxious, to take care of them, to give them as many positive new experiences as possible, to be the good child, or at a very great cost, mind you, often at a great cost, because, like I said before, it sounds great to be the good child, but we know how complicated it is to be the good child of parents who are very, very anxious. You know, I'll give you an example. I really think that my parents, relative to the incredibly wide range of Holocaust survivors that I've met, over hundreds and hundreds of people that I've met by now and met closely, interviewed closely, and really sort of get a good sense of who they were, I think my parents were at the very extreme end of those who remained relatively very healthy after the war. And still, you don't think that I have a bazillion examples of things such as, you know, I went to a conference. I was working for the Israeli government in Hamburg. And I was flown to a conference to speak about something for the Israeli government. And I met somebody from Yale University, and he said, you know, you have to come. I was looking to go already into doing my doctoral studies. It's like, you have to come. It's really, in 10 days, I'm arranging for you the interview, blah, blah, blah. I call my mom. I say, Mom, I just got back from wherever it was, and I just flew back into Hamburg, and I'm going to fly to the States in a few days. My mom was like, what? Yeah, the States? What do you mean? Who? Why? What? You know, the hyper-arousal, the inability to be more modulated, so that even when you do something good, but it's something that's not exactly on the path that's very safe and calm and doesn't arouse them, you already arouse anxiety. You already cause some, pain. And so it's very hard to be a good person, good child, and yet do the things that you want to do, because everything that you do that's a little bit off the path causes them anxiety, right? So you can be the good child and try. You may pay a very high price for this, as I say, and I see people who say, you know, I was accepted to Columbia University. My friend in Israel, I was accepted to Columbia University. I decided not to go because I couldn't leave my parents. My teenage sister was giving them a terrible time just at that time. I couldn't leave them with her. I had to stay. I gave it up. And he regrets it today. But he had to do that. On the other hand, so you can be the good child. You may succeed. You may succeed less than you might have. You may not have done certain things that you would have liked to do, but still succeed in life. There are all kinds of degrees, but that's the path of the good child. Or you may be the other one who says, I can't deal with this. The pain, their anxiety is so much, I can't deal with this. I have to completely disconnect myself from it if I am to have a life. And then you get people whose way of life seems unbelievably selfish. You know, I have 2 siblings like that I have been seeing for a long time. He is very successful professionally, but not very successful in his personal life. And he's very close with his mother. And they live in, he lives in the city. His sister lives in New Jersey. She was not successful professionally, but very successful in her marriage. She found somebody who protected her and allowed her to live essentially in the house, not having to work, not having to deal with the world, very constricted, very protected at home. The successful brother is the one that was very close with the parents. Father had Parkinson's for 15 years. He took care of him. He talks with the mother. He does everything that she needs with her. The sister lives in New Jersey. The mom lives in New York. She never came to visit them without her husband and children. And that she would do only once in a blue moon. You know, to me, it was very horrible. I thought, how could someone be so selfish, so uncaring towards their parents? I mean, I got on a plane to fly to Israel to see my parents 10 times more than she got into a car to come to New York to see her parents. Yes? And yet I have to tell you that having known this woman very well, from a very intimate place of being her therapist, I cannot tell you that this is a bad woman. I cannot tell you that this is a mean person. She's not selfish with regards to her husband, with her children. She's not. It was so terrible for her. Being with her parents was so terrible for her and so painful that she chose that way, which, believe me, is very unacceptable to me too. And I worked very much with her to try and help her get to another place. But it's not that she was mean or bad, but her behavior was unbelievably selfish. So what am I saying? That just because the trauma of the parents, not the trauma itself, just because the post-traumatic effects that linger with some of the parents are so difficult, it accentuates and makes much more extreme the differentiation between siblings. One takes it this way and one takes it that way. On them all the more, because there is one that takes it that way, the other one can take it that way. Yeah? It's exactly like the guy said to his sister in the letter. He was not wrong when he said, you think that I did all these bad things and da-da-da, and you blame me for this and this and this and that. What you don't see is that your ability to have your independent life and take care of your family and develop your professional life as you did and this and that is because I stayed here and took care of them. So it's also, like I said, when someone is taking the caretaker role, the other one is often freed by it to be very different. Look, one of the most important things that all mental health professionals know, and what we try to communicate to other people, our friends, our patients, our relatives, is that there is such a thing as what we call self-differentiation in all families. It's just a very important aspect of development of an individual within a family, right? We have two very important poles of development in our lives. One pole of developing our individuality and being ourself, and the other pole is being related and being connected and being part of a family, a group, a culture, right? These are two different forces, two different very important poles. If we go too extremely in one way at the expense of the other, we suffer, right? If we are all about autonomy and being ourselves and defining ourselves and, being an island, we suffer. If we're all or too much about being connected and doing what other people want and need from us, we suffer, right? Development optimally goes between these two sides, and is somehow, there are times when you have to do more in the direction of developing your autonomy, and then again connectedness, and then again your individuality, and then again connectedness, right? And it actually, I can show you this in terms of life development stages from early age. A baby has to first, be very, very connected and attached to their mother and get all of that. Then they have to be allowed to develop some autonomy. They start walking, they start exploring the world. It will be very bad if mommy will hold them back from it, right? They won't develop what they need to develop. And so it goes throughout life. In adolescence, they have to develop a little bit of their own selfhood at the cost of being sometimes not so polite and sometimes not doing exactly what we want, but we have to balance it out, right? We can't crush them and say, you cannot, because then they won't develop any sense of self, right? And then again, they marry. And in that phase, they have to work more on togetherness again and how to be intimate with another person, right? So throughout life, we have these different phases on both lines of development. And every family and every individual and every culture is characterized by a certain mixture of individuality and connectedness. Some cultures are characterized by a lot of emphasis on connectedness and not so much on individuality, right? Some cultures are much more about individuality than about connectedness, right? Some families differ and some individuals differ. In our Holocaust families, I think there was a problem finding sometimes the right balance. Some families are very enmeshed. They're like a soup of emotions. Everybody has to be doing what will not upset everybody else, and everybody has to be within that. And then there are people who can't deal with that, and in order to feel that they're somehow managing to create a life for themselves, they cut off from their family. They either cut off completely and say, I'm not talking to them ever again, or sometimes they behave like that without actually saying it, but they actually behave this way. Today, I saw a nice Jewish lady who lives near me. She has 2 sons who live 25 minutes away from her. She barely sees them, especially one of them. She had an accident. She cannot drive the 25 minutes by herself anymore. It's too far for her. She barely sees them. You know, so some people don't say, I'm not going to talk to you anymore, I'm cutting you off, but they actually behave in such a selfish way, and they do so little that de facto, practically, they sort of cut themselves off and they have their own lives, right? Differentiation is not being enmeshed and not being cut off. Differentiation means being yourself within relationships. It means me being able to say to my husband in a nice way, no, I don't think that I want to do that which you really want me to do, and let me tell you why, and we can talk about it, and we can, argue it, but it's not immediately I have to do what the other person wants, and it's also not a cutoff it's negotiating within the relationship. My point is that trauma in parents makes it very difficult to do that. And therefore, children growing up in these families where as soon as you say something that upsets your parent, there is a very strong reaction. They have 2 choices, essentially. Either surrender or cut off. Either surrender or shut down. Those are the choices, because the reaction is so strong. So what happens is that they don't learn what we would like our children and our grandchildren to learn. They don't learn within the family that it is okay to sometimes express opinions that are different, want to do something that your parents are not necessarily crazy about, and we can talk about it. It's not immediately this dysregulated reaction, which leaves you only those 2 choices. Either I completely give up, or I shut down and I go and I do not only that, but 10 times worse. Children of survivors are a very resilient group, all in all. And so you see these amazing things. I do see people where the stories are very difficult. Let's say the father was actually psychotic, the mother divorced him, was alone with 2 children, was herself very post-traumatic, very out of control, very scary, married another survivor, the survivor beat up my patient, all kinds of terrible stories. And then you ask her, so how did you come to be who you are? Because she's really a good mother, a professional, and she says, I focused on thinking everything that I knew I had to do the opposite. It's amazing.
Question: do you find in your experience that the oldest child of Holocaust survivors may have suffered more?
Although I can tell you that studies do not support it clearly, the findings are not clear about it. In my experience, certainly, and it makes sense. I mean, the oldest children were often born within no time from the end of the war and from the parents' liberation. It is inconceivable that they did not have absorbed certain things much more powerfully than children who were born 6, 7, 8, 10 years later. Yes, it's definitely. I actually have a patient who says they have a bit of an issue. The firstborn is kind of always depending on the parents, always sharing their problems. The other 2, very self-sufficient, protecting the parents from every bad news and not wanting, to drain the parents in any way, not financial, not emotional. And they're upset at the older sister often for doing that. But they say, They both say, these are friends of mine, not patients. They say, but we owe her a lot. She absorbed all of that stuff. You said it. But let me tell you, 20 years ago, when I presented in different places the results of my studies, research, not something I just thought, right? Research, the facts. There would be often someone who would come up in the audience. In fact, I actually had a very prominent psychoanalyst at a conference who is herself a survivor. She lost it in front of a room full of 200 professionals. She lost it at me and said, how dare you? How dare you talk about any effects on the second generation? That's like saying that, that's like blaming the parents. That's like saying... It's not blaming the parents. It's blaming the war. It's the fact that the war created such trauma that the trauma trickles down. It's not the fault of those who are traumatized. There's a lack of tolerance that I totally agree with you, which I think goes back to the same problem, which is that on some level, you know, the presence of life and death in family life is very disturbing. And life and death was part of family life in our families, yes? So when the parent who went through what they went through is responding like, you know, very upset because you're coming late from a party, for you, the meaning, the gravitas of what you're causing that parent who you know went through the Holocaust, and you also see it on their face. It's not just you're late. It's they're already imagining in 1,000 ways, 1,000 deaths that might have happened to you before you came home, right? Because they saw 1,000 deaths. Because they saw 1,000 deaths, and they suffered many, many losses. So for them, it's very real. And in that way, I mean, life and death are part of the family life. So the reaction to small things, the reaction to small differences is imbued with all of those very strong emotions. And as a result, children who grow up in that type of an atmosphere don't develop what we call the best communication skills or the best tolerance for when somebody feels different, thinks different. How can we continue to talk about it, like you said, in whichever way, but respectfully, and still remember that you're talking to somebody that you care about, and even if they have a very different opinion, or even if they tell you that they were really hurt by this thing that you did, you don't have to respond from that place. You can just say, oh, so I can see, I don't agree with you, but I can see that when I did that, and I didn't mean it this way, but I can see that from your side, it seemed like that. And we can come to some place without it being that one person, as I said, has to completely surrender, or there is a cutoff, and we can't talk about it at all, and now we're, you know, completely, that there are differences that can exist within a relationship. We don't do that so well as a group because, you know, because what I'm talking about is not just stuff that's somewhere, you know, there. It's enacted by us in many ways, in our marriages, in our relationship with other people, and in our relationship with each other.
Question: how many generations will it take to become normal between siblings? And what about for the third generation? When would that happen?
I think I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that you said, which are so important to me. I think that the reason why we have to talk about it is because what I'm saying, and I'm just writing a paper finally about it right now as we speak, is that I think that the impact of it, as you say, already in the first generation, it's very interesting. I see that already in the first generation, the survivors themselves, you had two phenomena that were very typical. On one hand, creating very close networks of relationships with other survivors. And at the same time, what you're talking about, a lot of bickering and a lot of stuff that could not be resolved, could not be talked about, just happened under the surface, over the surface. Sometimes there were, geysers, their entire lives. The same people could have, I think that it wasn't exactly the same people, that there are subgroups. I totally agree with you. In the second generation, what I see is because of those patterns that I discussed so far with you, and I'm sorry, it's a little bit fragmented because there's so much to say about it, but all in all, I think we kind of get a certain sketch of what I'm talking about. So what happens because of this is there are these resentments between the two different types of siblings, and either before the parents die, sometimes just like you say, when someone is like this from an early age on, where one is taking care of the parents and the other one is essentially very selfish, doing their own thing, barely helping, barely being there, then it happens already before. But in many families, because of the respect for the parents, siblings who actually have a lot of resentments maintain some kind of a facade. Often, it's actually the nicer sibling, if you like, the one that's nicer to the parents, the one that cares more, the one that does more, who's being pressured by the parents, often terribly pressured, to take all kinds of horrible behaviors from the other one, because you're the a lot of pressure on the one who's actually healthier and nicer and more decent to accept all kinds of horrible behaviors because, because they can push on this one and not on the crazy one, right? The crazy one will blow up and make a terrible scene. If it's the Seder night, if it's Rosh Hashanah, who cares, right? And they'll blow up and destroy the holiday. So they ask this person and they pressure this person, and everybody keeps it on some level kind of under control until the parents pass away. And when the parents pass away, there is a total cutoff in the relationship and a total disconnect. And what that means as a culture, as an ethnic group and a culture, it means that for us, there is a much higher risk, especially in this country. It happens very quickly in this country. It is an enormous country. So, but even New Jersey, as I said, is far enough from New York. If siblings stop talking to each other, their children, within no time, are strangers to one another. They don't even know, they have no connection, they don't connect with each other, they don't want to get together, they don't know each other, they're not at all family. What does it mean? It means that the trickling down of trauma through the dynamics in the family actually destroys the fabric of the extended family and of an entire group, of an entire culture. Yes? So that's why it's so important to me to talk about it, because sometimes, like in the case of my patient M, with her brother who went to the army, they have a very difficult relationship. It's not like they've become lovey-dovey after therapy. But, first of all, her relationship with her parents got much, much better to the enormous benefit of both her aging parents and herself. So she gained some very good years now of being very well loved by her parents, that she never felt they loved her. Now they're older, they can do different than when they were younger. It got much, much better. She was able to divorce her horrible husband. They were very supportive. And she was able to see her brother in a different way and establish some kind of a connection with him, recognizing, there is a play by Henry Miller called, I think, The Prince. And it is a very American play about a very American, very Goyish family in which there are two brothers. And it's very similar in principle because one brother stays with their very, I don't know, dysfunctional alcoholic father in the little town and takes care of him, and the other one leaves and makes a better life. And when the father dies, he comes back, and there's this confrontation between the two brothers about their lives, very similar to what I'm telling you here. And he says to him something, a sentence which I can't quite quote as it was, but he essentially says to him, the one who stayed, says, "You don't understand, we took the same journey in just two different paths." And that's what I think is so important for us to understand when we have all kinds of issues and resentments and we feel so morally entitled to our judgment of our siblings because of their different path. We have to remember that it's just different ways in which each of us coped with something very difficult in the family dynamics, and each of us did what they could do, the best that they could do. It doesn't necessarily mean that one of us is bad. It means that's what they could do with the same stressor. Each of us coped in a different way, in the way that they felt was available to them because of a variety of things to survive this traumatic legacy and to do well with that traumatic legacy, which all in all, as a group, we did well. So the proof is in the pudding, but we have different ways, and sometimes we disagree and don't like the other ways of the other, but just a little bit of compassion and understanding, so that even when we really dislike our siblings' way, to remember that, and to remember that even if we and our siblings really don't like each other, it's really important to maintain enough connection that will allow their children to have a relationship, because otherwise, within 2 generations, we are actually, I hate to say it in a very extreme way, but I will, we are fulfilling and reenacting the destruction of the Jewish family. There's going to be no family. There's going to be this family in California and that family in Jerusalem and this family in New York, and they don't have any interest in one another, no connection, no help, no sense of togetherness. As one patient of mine said, her parents were of the kind that created a group around them of survivors and Landsman, and they had that. And she said, I have a brother, and she was one of those that was always being pressured by the mother to accept her brother's out there behavior because he was really out of control. And she said, they had their Landsman and their friends. After they lost everything else, they at least had that. I don't even have my brother. No, I don't even have my brother. And that we have to be aware of. We have to at least understand that when we are so angry with our siblings, when we are so angry with our cousins or whoever it may be, that we have to put it in some perspective of this phenomena, of the trauma in our families, and maybe it helps us to kind of take it a notch down and have a little bit more understanding, a little bit more compassion, a little bit more, okay, so it's different. I don't like it, but all right. And work really hard to make it so that even if we don't like them, that their children and our children have somehow an opportunity to find each other, because they actually might be protected enough already from the trickle-down effects to have nothing to do with these family dynamics and be completely able to be good friends, good relationships. They might be the children, which is now the 4th generation. Just one second, Elisa.
Okay, I was going to say, wow, I didn't realize my question was going to go. So I wanted to kind of comment that when we look at the way that we are as a coping style to deal with whatever came before us, sometimes as our lives change, we develop new coping styles, and regardless of whether you're from a survivor family or not, your siblings pick up on that and they react to that. And if they say, oh, she was always the meek one, but I see that she's getting a little more assertive, then they might say, she's changing a little bit, and they might react a little differently to that one, or vice versa. If you see somebody who was always the blowing up aggressive one, who maybe found a different coping style in their marriage or their work life or something, and they try something out with one of their siblings now that the parents are older, or maybe even not here anymore, and they get a good response from the more meeker sibling who says, I'm so happy we're able to talk about this. It's a very positive, good thing, and we all learn and grow. I think that from working with the survivors that I work with every day, they're in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and 100s, and they continue to grow. So
absolutely, right. And I think that's very important, and for that, I think, is another reason why gatherings of second generation are important, because it supports, it's like a sibling substitute kind of a thing, and it allows one to think about these things not in the context of the family, and then supports the courage that it takes, because it takes a lot of courage to try and act differently with the people that know you from the time you were born. It's very difficult. I mean, I come to Israel, and I sometimes, as I get, my siblings are 10 and 12 years older than I, and so I was really little when we were still in the same house. I was really little, and they were already people. And until now, I have sometimes this feeling when their friends get together who are, I have friends now who are those ages, no problem. But when it's my siblings' friends who get together, I'm like, am I already allowed in this room?
Question. After all that Holocaust survivors went through, how did they allow themselves to disconnect from relatives? Why wouldn't they appreciate that there was someone left in their family?
Because of what I said, actually, I'll tie it to that. First of all, a lot of them did have a great appreciation and really did tend, these relationships greatly, and supported and looked for anybody, a third cousin and a whatnot. So that has to be stated, and it's a well-known phenomenon, these very tight-knit. The other thing is actually very understandable when you understand trauma and you understand post-traumatic behaviors and post-traumatic reactions. People who have post-traumatic reactions have a very low tolerance for anything that arouses them, okay? Now, relationships are a very arousing thing. Relationships have a lot of triggers in them, because if you have a relationship with someone, you have expectations, you have, all of the things, right? And all of that becomes a possible trigger for I thought that you would do this and you didn't do this. How could she not have done that? How could she have given only $150 instead of that? All kinds of expectations, all kinds of how we do things, which in normal relationships exist, right? It's the material from which relationships are made. When people are not post-traumatic, under optimal conditions, not just not post-traumatic, optimal. Under optimal conditions, we can come to our friend and say, I was really here, my patient this morning, okay? Her daughter had a birthday, and her sister and her family decided to go to some baseball thing instead of coming to the birthday. And she was very offended. Under optimal conditions, we can talk to our sister and say, I was really offended. We are such a small family, and our mother is crazy, and our other sister is crazy. It's so important to me that the two of us will have, and that our children will have, and you went under optimal circumstances. But if people are post-traumatic, then first of all, anything that it's very arousing, and the reactions are very strong, And if the reactions are very strong, there's going to be immediately a thing like that, and then there is a cutoff, right? Or they know that their reactions are like that, so they avoid anything that might be contentious because they know they can't handle it. But what happens then is that nothing gets addressed, and it festers, and so at home, when the other person doesn't hear it, you, the children, hear, Tante, how could she do this? How could, she's such a, and it festers, and it destroys the relationship from within, or there are occasional, things that blow up. So why? Just because when you are post-traumatic, it's very hard to remain regulated. And what do we have to learn for ourselves and for our children? What's really the most important thing that we need to work on at this point in life is actually to do whatever works for us, to find out what works for us, what helps us maintain and increase our capacity for self-regulation. So that even when somebody triggers us, even when somebody does something that we really think is wrong, that we really think is upsetting, that we can say it in a nice way, appropriate way, not meek way, not anything, say it, but not get explosive, not get dysregulated. That's really the main point for us to work on. But when people can't do that because they have been through hell, and because they lost so much, they are afraid to do it because they're afraid of losing the relationship. When you're very afraid that saying anything can cost you the relationship, you won't say it. Or you will say it in the least good time and in the least good way, right? That's why it was a bit of an issue. Like I said in the beginning, we do see that we can get that. We can get the children to bond not only when there is trauma in the family and when the parents are not available. We, of course, can also enhance and foster closeness between the children. The more we are able to not, it all goes back to our degree of self-regulation. Because our children were survivors' children were so angry at each other, the more the parent was dysregulated, the more they thought that the other sibling is hurting the parent, the more it fueled their resentment towards each other. Whether the parent was upset because you abandoned and you don't care enough, or whether the parent was upset because you told him all of your troubles and all of your tzues, but what fueled the resentments between the siblings was as dysregulated as the parent was. That's how intense their resentments were towards each other. So if we can be as regulated as we can and deal with them, so directly with each child, and also each child seeing how we handle the other child when there is any issue, if we can be regulated, that's the best way to keep our children to foster their self-regulation and their bond with each other. You might have done a good job. Let's hope. Some of us did a really good job, we hope.
Question: is there any real possibility for healing?
Yes, there is real healing available. First of all, what we see in many different samples, Holocaust survivors as well as other populations that were exposed to extreme mass trauma, a third of the people that actually have PTSD in the initial time after, a third will recover spontaneously with time, and another third will improve greatly in time, about. So that's just the natural process of the disorder. Yeah. On top, those who do not improve at all for a certain period of time, which is, let's say, certainly those who do not improve at all after 1 year, certainly those who do not improve at all after 2 years are at much higher risk for a chronic disorder. But, like I said, a third remit and a third get much better just without any intervention, just the natural healing that we're capable of. We're an unbelievably resilient species, yes? And there are now, on the basis of all the studies that took place since 1980, when the diagnosis was finally introduced, and one could finally do really empirical studies that used the same parameters and looked and could compare things, there are many, many very effective treatments that we see have a good impact. So now, today, if someone has PTSD, it's really important to, address it. First, it's okay to wait a little while to see if one just gets better by themselves. But if one doesn't get better by themselves within the first, let's say, 6 months, then there's no reason to wait longer than that, and one needs to get treatment, and one can get a lot better. So what I think is also very important to say is that in my work, I find that for the second generation, in general, but certainly for the second generation, it was we are a generation after Armageddon. We are the generation after a thing that nobody knew how to deal with, right? So it was very important for us to prove to ourselves that that we could build our lives, and we could do, and we were also a part of a time and a cohort where psychotherapy was, an ambivalent thing. Wasn't exactly as acceptable maybe as it is today. But what I see now is that people in general, and the second generation in particular, between the ages of 45 and kind of 60, there is a new window of opportunity of growth, because it's a kind of like adolescence is a time of a lot of growth and change and reorganization internally, and then we become young adults, and it sort of levels off a little bit, and we're much more busy with building our career and building our family and taking care of children, and who has time to think about themselves and what their inner whatnot machinations are, right? And then you wake up at 45 or 50, and your children are grown, and your career is where it is, and you're not going to become the president anymore if you haven't become a president yet. So you're kind of where you are professionally, and you've proven to yourself a lot of things, and you've proven to yourself a lot of things in terms of your strengths, and you've accomplished a lot of things that have contributed to your sense of who you are. And all of a sudden, with the children kind of out of the way, and with the pressure to build your career kind of leveling off, there is a new window and a new sort of interest and possibility of channeling all the stuff that you've gained in all those years of what you've done to reorganize internally. And I see people really kind of blossoming and coming to therapy and making huge changes and huge reorganizations and really overcoming all kinds of things that they have struggled with for a long time and changing their lives. And I think that it's an amazing opportunity that now, when we live so much longer, if you think about the fact that people, my father used to tell me that in Poland, somebody who was 60 was really old, but today someone who's 60 is really young. And so you can imagine that if at 45, 50, we reorganize and we blossom and we find new ways of coping and new ways of doing things and new courage and new ways to express ourselves, that you can have, 35 years of a much different, much better life. I think it's worth it.